Hello and welcome to this unit. I'm Dr. Shyaonti Talwar, and in this unit, we are going to look at Cleanth Brooks's notion of paradox as the structure of poetry. So, first, let us try and understand the background of Cleanth Brooks. Brooks was born in the year 1906 and he passed on in 1994. He was an American literary critic and professor of considerable repute. And he was again a very prominent figure of new criticism. He can be credited for revolutionizing the teaching of poetry in American higher education. He is known for his phenomenal works, the well wrought urn, studies in the structure of poetry, which was published in the year 1947, and modern poetry and the tradition in 1939. Brooks helped formulate formalist criticism, emphasizing the interior life of a poem. So, by now, we have understood that all of these new critics were majorly preoccupied with understanding the poem as a standalone text, as an independent text, right? As an independent piece of creative expression or literary expression, and they try to keep the poem separate from its background, from the cultural factors or the socio-political factors which could have influenced the making of it. So he is again one of those who wants to look at the interior life, what he calls and coins as the interior life, the internal life of a poem. And that automatically leads to a close textual reading of a particular piece. So he is the one to have codified or laid down the rules and laid down the very foundation of close reading or close textual analysis. And he argued, now this is where it gets interesting, he argued for the centrality of ambiguity and paradox as a way of understanding poetry. Now, we will try and figure out what is this paradox and why does Brooks feel that paradox is absolutely indispensable to understand poetry. So, what he tries to propound is that first of all we have to identify the central paradox in a poem and then interpret the poem in the light of the paradox. So let us look at paradox as the structure of poetry as proposed by Brooks. So, like I said earlier, Brooks was of the opinion that paradox is central to understanding and interpreting poetry. And he also believes, and I quote him here, that paradox is the language that is both appropriate and inevitable. Inevitable meaning unavoidable to poetry. And Brooks believed that poetic language is a very specialized use of language. It is unlike the use of language, say, in science or in other disciplines, because all of those disciplines demand a very factual use of language, a day to day use of language. Whereas if you look at poetry, he believed that the poet must make up his language as he goes. So the poet is in the process of creating their own language as they proceed with the creative work. So they construct their language and then they go and define the rules of the language, and they shape the literature accordingly. Now, we are well aware of this idea, the notion of poetic license in poetry, where at times we see unusual use of words or maybe a kind of dismissal of grammar and using words very unconventionally, very ungrammatically. Now that it could be, so poetic license could be one way of looking at what Brooks is trying to say, that poets enjoy a special license